Hello. I'd like to take a look now at a topic called self-esteem. We've all heard of self-esteem, of course, but I'd like to ask of myself and others to think what we mean by self-esteem and why do we crave so much having it. Well, I would begin by talking of what both I and someone who used to write a lot about self-esteem has either said or thought about. And that is that self-esteem has two components, basically. This is both my thinking and that of Dr. Nathaniel Branden, Branden, where he in particular talks about self-esteem as feeling what I would call useful to others, or at least that's the way I put it. And secondly, to feel efficacious, that you can make things happen on your own behalf, which I would say then can give you a feeling that you can survive, and that would naturally make us all happy, wouldn't it? So, I believe this first part is something that we most think about when we talk about self-esteem, and that is to feel that we have assets that some people would find valuable, or at least one person, perhaps a spouse or other person in a relationship that we're in. And the idea being that if we think we have an asset that someone else could find very useful, then when push comes to shove in life, especially, and we have special need of assistance, we think we can count on someone providing help on the basis of what you might call a trade, whereby if we have something to offer, we figure they'll offer something in return. Thus, in my opinion, the big component of self-esteem is sort of a mental calculation in the back of our minds that we can scratch other people's back and hopefully count on someone else scratching ours in return. And that we have what it takes to make a fair trade, if you will. Now, I think both I and Nathaniel Branden also talk perhaps of pseudo self-esteem, where some of us may think only in our imagination that we have certain assets to offer others, and then hope that we would get something back in return as per a trade again. But the word pseudo comes in to play to mean that these assets are only a figment of our imagination and not really there. Hence the term narcissist, meaning, in my opinion, a person who thinks they have certain key qualities or assets to offer others, but in fact they're a little illusioned about this fact, because the assets they think they have, being quite great in their mind, often are much less than that in reality. Then the task of the narcissist, if you will, is to try and convince others they have these talents that they don't actually have, and perhaps ensnare someone, if you will, in a relationship before that person realizes that the supposed assets really aren't there, or are there to a much lesser extent than originally thought. Now, some commonplace assets, I would say, that people either have insignificant degree or think they have, imaginary, are things like the capacity to love, or the ability to be a provider of pleasure sexually, or the ability to provide money, or let's say the ability to provide soothing, which you might consider a major portion of love. Or let's say you may be able to provide information or great skills, let's say as a doctor or someone else. Again, in essence, providing certain forms of information acted out in certain skill sets. And if this information, in fact, isn't performing what you might call a useful task function, perhaps you're providing information that satisfies someone's hunger for curiosity, such as if you write books about relativity or science, such may satiate the curiosity of some smaller number of people in society. And then there are those who can offer what you might call diversions. Let's say if you're an entertainer, or you perhaps write books in the genres of romance or fantasy, like the books The Hobbit or J.R. Tolkien's books. At any rate, these strike me as some of the major things that we can offer people, or may think we have to offer people. And if we don't have any of these to offer, I suppose a lot of us might try, or some of us might try, to pretend we have them to offer, hoping to fool someone else, so that they will feel that we're useful to them, and we're hoping they could scratch our back in return, either now or at some future point in time. Now for part 2, so to speak, of what makes us feel we have high self-esteem and then feel safer in life, happier. I would say, and Nathaniel Branden too, that if we don't feel we have something to offer others, that someone would find useful at least one person, then perhaps we would turn to saying to ourselves, instead of having a sort of dependency here or a trade, why not just be independent completely? Totally self-reliant, in the sense of Ralph Waldo Emerson talking about self-reliance in his famous essay, such that then we would be talking about feeling very efficacious, as Nathaniel Branden says, able to make things happen, in a sense, a feeling like we have control to, let's say, create things that we could then sell, perhaps, to an employer who may or may not like us but want our product, especially if our product is good, either in terms of a skill set or ideas, either way. But at any rate, having a feeling that we can generate something and control our environment to make things happen, even if someone doesn't necessarily like us or know us. You might say then that this kind of self-esteem would be very useful if there were, say, a nuclear war and everyone died except you or me. Then, of course, what good would it be to feel we have assets to offer others? The second part of self-esteem would then kick in, saying that if I think I know ways to survive without anyone else on the planet being in existence, that too might make me feel good enough to feel somewhat safe and somewhat happy. This then being the extreme of what you might call self-reliance, once again. Now, I would take this further yet, beyond what Nathaniel Branden talks about, and go to what I might say is even a more elevated level, and that is to reach a point where we might say we can be okay or happy, or in other words, feel somewhat safe and content, even if we felt that we neither had anything to offer anyone in sort of a trade, or also that we didn't have any ability to make things happen to get our needs met without anyone else out there. And in essence then, you might say, what some few in India perhaps have said, that we're able to accept whatever happens with equanimity, without a big bunch of worry and consternation. For most of us would say that we would be quite worried and distraught if we can't get our needs met. But perhaps this third and most elevated way would be to say that we can accept life okay if we can't get our needs met, in fact, any way possible. This then would be ultimately an acceptance of death, a concept most of us don't think that much about, I believe, from day to day, but some people who particularly may be of a very spiritual nature do think about. They do think about death and accepting it, especially accepting death if we can't put it in perspective of it happening in an average perspective, let's say 79 years of life, such that we accept whatever happens, even if we can't get any help from anyone or make anything happen to prevent it from happening in what you might call an untimely fashion, as we imagine it anyway. One person, for instance, who has videos or podcasts on this topic of acceptance, who I love very much, his material, is a man who has a YouTube channel, and his name is Anubhaf, Anubhaf, and his YouTube channel is called Spirituality Stop, all one word. He focuses predominantly on the topic of acceptance, and not on how to get your needs met. Now, at this point, I'd like to talk a little bit about how our typical craving for high levels of acceptance, or rather high self-esteem, can sometimes be used against us by some. For if we were to want to talk about some people manipulating us in order to get things they want to happen expediently, perhaps, I personally see this playing out especially in several different scenarios. First, either to get something expediently by force, or by deception, or by a third method so favorite to some, the lowering or destruction of someone else's self-esteem, their opinion of themselves, as to their assets and ability to control things and make things happen. And so this seems to be very popular as a means of what you might call manipulation, to try and lower someone else's self-esteem. But then by self-esteem I mean both lowering of someone else's opinion of their real assets, or if they have few or none of those, lowering of their opinion of assets they think they have in their imagination. And so here enters the word, perhaps, narcissistic wound, whereby the narcissist, so to speak, has an imaginary picture of assets they have. And what better way to try and manipulate a person by either demeaning assets they really have, such that they start to doubt they have them, or secondly, to point out to people in sort of a rude fashion, if you will, that the assets they are imagining they have don't really exist, and you're claiming that to them, often in very uncompassionate, unsympathetic ways. And this then, particularly, I maintain, is what you would call a narcissistic wound. To sort of inform someone somehow that they're not who they thought they are, that they're not what you might call hot stuff, and thus making them feel both that they have little to offer or can't make things happen on their own like they thought they could. But in either way, this being very painful to have happen to a person. And so personally, I see this attack on self-esteem playing out so often in our society in particular by many strangers, let's say, in a store, being rather defensive. And by that I mean almost being on the offensive, in that they might try and attack your self-esteem and lower it before you get a chance to do the same to them. They're either assuming that you would try to lower their self-esteem like a rather uncompassionate parent might have done to them when they were a child, or perhaps they're in an environment where there are, in fact, so many people trying to do this to them that they intuitively know this and react by being on the offensive and making sure they do it to others before it happens to them. But in either way, there being a general attitude that they better make sure their self-esteem isn't lowered. And so I'm thinking right now that perhaps some of these people, a considerable number of them, grew up with one or two parents who shamed them a lot, or who were very perfectionistic. But at either rate, in either circumstance, this person feeling their self-esteem assaulted quite regularly as children, and sometimes overgeneralizing this when they become adults and expecting this to be the case happening to them from all people around them. This, of course, then can lead to a general attitude of defensiveness and being on the offense, attacking others' self-esteem before theirs is attacked, or they think it would always be attacked. So, this is my take on what self-esteem is all about and why we have a craving for it so often. That, in fact, we tend to have a craving for high self-esteem to make us feel we can survive, with a certain amount of resources at our disposal and a certain level of comfort. And that perhaps at a certain point in time, some people may come to the point where they would say that they really don't need that much self-esteem anymore because they can accept no matter what happens to them, including what you might call pain from losses, including the losses involved in an early death as they interpret it. I hope this is of some use to some people. This is a topic I've been thinking of on and off through the years, but especially intensely over the past year now, with respect to the concept that just perhaps we tend to focus a little too much on getting high self-esteem and not enough on acceptance of whatever might be, if in fact we have little or no value to anyone and can't make anything happen in fact. This hopefully not always being the case, of course, but you never know in life. I wish you well.